Hi, Mr. Christian's asked me to make a little video here about bread, which I am happy to do. I love making bread. So, I've started making a dough here, and I'm using whole wheat flour and bread flour, and these are great because they not only are good for you, whole wheat flours, but they have a lot of protein. And protein is a key ingredient when you're making bread. In the bread, there are two kinds of proteins, glutenin and gliadin. And these two proteins, when you combine them with water, form something called gluten. So I mix the flour and water, and I also put in some other ingredients, and I want to do something called kneading. And I want to knead my dough to make the gluten start to form. And you want to get your gluten to be strong enough that where you can pick up some of your dough and stretch it so that you can actually see sunlight through it. That's called the window pane test, so you could see through it like a window. Now this isn't quite ready because it breaks apart, but it's getting closer. Now why is gluten so important? Well, in bread there's also something called yeast. Now this loaf of bread has active dry yeast and natural yeast. Yeast is a single-celled fungus that's just everywhere, all around us. Sourdough, this sourdough is from yeast just in the air. This one is yeast that's dormant and that becomes active when you put it with water. And yeast eats sugar. So it eats the sugars and the wheat, and then the sugar that I put in this bread, I put a little honey in it. And as it eats the sugar, it farts carbon dioxide. There's no other way to say it. And those little carbon dioxide farts get caught in the gluten, and it makes little bubbles, and it causes this pile of dough to rise and double. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. All right, here's my dough. I've kneaded it. Look at this stretch. It's not starting to tear yet. So I'm feeling pretty good about where the gluten network is at. And I'm just gonna now let it sit. I'm gonna cover it. I'm gonna come back in about 45 minutes and I'll show you what it looks like. We'll see what the yeast have done. Hey, hopefully you can see the dough has gotten a little bigger here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give it a couple of folds, stretch it out a little, and then just let it sit for another little proof here. And then we'll check back in on it in another hour or so. All right, here we are back at the bread. I think I'm ready to take this thing out, shape it into a loaf, and put it in a loaf pan. All right, we've got our loaf shaped and put in a loaf pan. And guess what? We're gonna let it sit. And you know why? We want those yeast to keep feeding on the sugar and to get this bread to rise a little more. It's gonna proof. And then when we finally put it in the oven, it'll rise even more with something called oven spring. That's what I'm talking about. All right, you can see how this loaf has filled out this pan. We're just gonna take a knife here and score it along the center, or off center in this case. Oven's at 425. There's our bread. It's gonna go in here for 5 minutes at a high temp, and then we're gonna knock the temp down. Awesome. And here we go. 35 minutes later, a beautiful loaf of bread. We're gonna take it out and put it on the cooling rack. Make sure it cools completely before you slice it open, or else you'll lose moisture.